The ICU never sleeps. How could it? And neither does he. Jeong Sang-Hoo had been watching her for 11 days. Not because he was obsessed, at least, that's what he told himself. He watched because she was different. Because when every other doctor in that unit looked at him and saw a file, a chart, a liability, she looked at him and saw a person. She said his name correctly on the first try. She checked on him after her shift ended. She brought warmth into a room that was built to keep people alive, but never made them feel it. So yes, he watched. From the trauma bay. From the hallway, from the shadows that Seoul's most feared kingpin had spent a lifetime learning how to disappear into, even here, in the middle of Brooklyn. He was watching the morning everything broke open. Dr. Toria Bryant was mid-sentence, clipboard in hand, when it happened. No warning, no build-up, just the sharp, sudden violence of Dr. Randy Wilmont's fist closing into her hair, snatching her backward like she was something he owned, something he could handle, something beneath him. His voice dropped into that particular register that men like him use when they want to humiliate without witnesses. Low, deliberate, poisonous. The clipboard hit the floor. A nurse looked away. A resident suddenly found something very important to study on his shoes. And the entire ICU did what institutions do when power protects the wrong person. It held its breath and looked the other way. Nobody saw Sang-Hoo move. That's the thing about men who've spent their lives inside violence. They don't telegraph it. There's no dramatic rise from the chair. No cracking of knuckles. No warning. One moment, he was in the doorway. The next, he was there. And the sound of his open palm connecting with Dr. Wilmont's face rang through the entire unit like a thunderclap. Not a punch. Not a shove. A slap. Deliberate. Devastating. The kind that says, I could have done so much worse. And I want you to know that. Wilmont's head snapped sideways. His glasses left his face before he did. He hit the nurse's station with his shoulder, caught himself on shaking arms, and turned around with blood already blooming at the corner of his mouth, only to find Sang-Hoo standing completely still, breathing normally, watching him with the calm, patient expression of a man who has all the time in the world. The ICU didn't just go quiet. It stopped existing. Monitors beeped. Nobody heard them. Sang-Hoo didn't look at Wilmont again. He looked at her. At Toria, who stood frozen, one hand instinctively raised to the hair that had just been released, eyes wide, chest rising and falling too fast, staring at this man she had treated 11 days ago like he was a person and not a monster. He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he straightened his jacket, turned, and walked back toward his room like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of a hospital ward. Like the most powerful, most feared, most untouchable man in all of Seoul hadn't just made an impulsive decision that was going to cost him, and decided she was worth every single consequence. Behind him, Wilmont was already reaching for his phone. Behind him, 2 nurses were whispering with wide eyes. Behind him, the institution was already preparing its response. And Sang-Hoo? Sang-Hoo was thinking about the way she said his name on the first day. Like it mattered. Like he mattered. Yeah, worth it. Here's what makes this moment so psychologically loaded. Researchers studying bystander intervention found that when someone finally breaks the silence and acts, even impulsively, it shatters what's called pluralistic ignorance, the collective illusion that everyone else is okay with what's happening. Sang-Hoo's slap didn't just offend Toria. It forced an entire room to confront what they chose not to see. This is a story about a room full of people who chose silence, one man who chose chaos, and a woman who has no idea that the most dangerous person in Brooklyn just made her his most important decision. If you're here for the stories where the unbothered finally get bothered, where one impulsive moment unravels into something neither person planned for, where danger looks like protection and protection feels like falling, subscribe because we are nowhere near done. More slow burns, more explosive moments, more men who don't know how to love quietly and women who didn't ask to be chosen, but got chosen anyway. Smash that like button and tell me in the comments. Where are you right now? One earbud in at work? Lying in bed when you should be sleeping? On your commute pretending to check your email? Drop your city and your situation. I want to know exactly who's out here with me tonight. The ICU at Brooklyn Central ran on three things: fluorescent light, controlled panic, and the quiet authority of Dr. Toria Bryant. She moved through the unit the way water moves through stone, not forcing anything, just finding every crack, every need, every patient who had been reduced to a number on a whiteboard and reminding them, gently, persistently, that they were still a person. She tucked her locks back when she leaned over charts. She laughed softly at terrible jokes from frightened old men. She remembered names. Not just patient names. She remembered the names of their dogs, their grandchildren, the shows they watched before all of this happened to them. It was, Jeong Sang-Hoo had decided, the most dangerous thing he had ever witnessed. He sat in the trauma bay with 11 stitches in his side and a cover story that 3 of his men had already confirmed with the attending on call. A bar fight. Wrong place, wrong time. Nothing to see. He had been in worse hospitals in worse countries with worse injuries and had never once allowed himself the indulgence of staying. You get stitched. You leave. You don't linger where the lights are bright and the questions are polite but relentless. And yet, Day 3 became Day 5. Day 5 became Day 8. Day 8 became 11. Fascinating. His second-in-command had texted on Day 9 with no further comment. Sang-Hoo had not responded. He watched her work the morning rounds from the doorway of his bay, positioned at an angle that let him see without being seen, a habit so deeply embedded in his body it required no conscious thought. He watched the way she paused at the bed of an elderly Haitian man who spoke almost no English and found a way to communicate warmth without a shared language, her hands moving gently, her face doing the work that words couldn't. He watched a family of 4 collapse into her in the hallway and hold themselves together against her steady, unmovable calm. Asterisk fun fact. The human nervous system can detect genuine compassion versus performed compassion. Our mirror neurons fire differently in response to authenticity. We feel the difference before we can name it. Asterisk. Sang-Hoo had spent his entire life surrounded by performed loyalty, performed respect, performed love. He recognized the real thing the way a starving man recognizes food, with his whole body, before his mind caught up. That was the problem. She had come to his bay on the first evening, not the attending, not the resident, her, to review his chart and explain the overnight monitoring protocol. Standard. Routine. Except she had looked at him, really looked at him, the way people almost never looked at him outside of fear, and said his name exactly right. Not Young, not Jeong, Jeong. The correct weight on the correct syllable, like she had taken 30 seconds before walking in to make sure she got it right. Such a small thing. He had not slept well since. Now it was day 11 and he was medically cleared, and he had found reasons, thin, unconvincing reasons, to remain. His second-in-command had stopped texting entirely, which was somehow worse. The silence of a man watching his boss slowly lose his mind and choosing, wisely, to say nothing about it. Sang-Hoo watched Toria finish her rounds and push through the double doors toward the nurse's station, and he was in the middle of deciding, seriously and finally, that he would leave today. Today, when Dr. Randy Wilmont materialized from the attending's corridor like something that had no business existing in a place built for healing. He had seen Wilmont before. Had clocked him the same way he clocked every variable in any environment, quickly, completely, filed away. Arrogant. Institutional. The particular brand of dangerous that comes not from violence but from entitlement, from a whole life of systems designed to absorb his worst behavior and return it to him laundered and consequence-free. He watched Wilmont's eyes find Toria. He watched Wilmont's expression shift into something that made the temperature behind Sang-Hoo's sternum drop 10 degrees. He was already rising from the chair before Wilmont moved. Some part of him, the oldest, most animal part, already knew, but he was not fast enough for what happened next. The rain came down on Brooklyn like it had a personal grievance. Toria stood outside the staff exit on Flatbush Avenue with her bag pulled to her chest, and her jaw set in the particular way it had been set for 6 hours. Tight, controlled, the physical manifestation of a woman holding herself together through sheer will and professional obligation. The hospital had given her a form. An incident report form, as though what happened this morning was a slip-and-fall situation, a minor workplace irregularity. a box to be checked and filed and forgotten in a drawer somewhere on the 4th floor. She had taken the form. She had not filled it out. She stood in the rain and let it hit her face and breathed. Asterisk the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, cannot distinguish between physical danger and social humiliation. To your nervous system, both register as survival threats. Her body wasn't overreacting. It was doing exactly what it was built to do. Asterisk. Her hands were still trembling. Not from fear. She had moved past fear sometime around hour 2. This was something older and colder. The specific exhaustion of being harmed in a room full of witnesses and then being handed paperwork about it. She heard the footsteps behind her a half-second before the rain stopped hitting her. Not all of it. Just, the rain hitting her specifically stopped, and she became aware of warmth at her back, and she turned. Jeong Sang-Hoo stood behind her holding a black umbrella over her head, his left shoulder entirely exposed to the downpour, his jacket darkening with water at the seam, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not pity. Not the soft, devastating pity she had been receiving all day from nurses who looked at her like she was already broken. Something else. Something that sat behind his eyes with tremendous patience and weight. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. For longer than was socially acceptable, neither of them said a word. "You're getting soaked," she finally said. "You weren't." He said it simply. Like it was a complete answer. Like his shoulder meant nothing and her dryness meant everything, and there was no further math required. Toria looked at him. Really looked the way she had looked at him 11 days ago when she had pulled up his chart and decided that whoever this man was, he deserved to be spoken to like a human being. She had known then in the abstract, clinical way that he was dangerous. The men outside his bay. The way staff moved differently in his corridor. The attendings careful, deliberately incurious chart notes. She knew now in a less abstract way. She had watched him cross that ICU this morning in total silence and introduce the flat of his palm to Randy Wilmont's face with a precision that didn't read as rage. It read as decision. That was somehow more frightening. Rage, she understood. Rage was heat and noise and aftermath. What Sang-Hoo had done was cold. Architectural. The violence of a man who had long ago made peace with his own capacity for it. And then he had looked at her, only at her, and walked away. "You're going to have problems," she said. "Because of this morning." "I have many problems," he said. This morning was not one of them. The rain intensified. He didn't shift the umbrella. His shoulder kept taking it. "Why have you still been here?" she asked. "You were cleared 2 days ago." Something moved through his expression. Brief, almost imperceptible. The micro-expression of a man who had an honest answer he hadn't yet decided whether to give. She watched him make the decision in real time. Watched him land on a version of the truth. "I wasn't ready to leave." It was not a full answer. She understood it was not a full answer. But there was something in the way he said it. Quiet, undefended, stripped of the careful architecture he wore like a second skin, that made it feel more honest than anything she had heard all day. The rain kept falling. He kept the umbrella over her. His jacket was soaked through now, water running along the line of his jaw, and he didn't so much as glance at it. Toria looked at this man, this soaking, dangerous, inexplicable man, and felt something shift in her chest that she had absolutely no business feeling on a day like today. She slid slightly to the left, making room under the umbrella. He stepped in without a word. Their shoulders touched. Neither of them moved away. The car was black, unmarked, and idling on a side street off Atlantic Avenue like it had always belonged there. Like the city had simply grown up around it and accepted it as permanent. Sang-Hoo held the door open. Not with the performative chivalry of a man trying to impress, with the quiet expectation of a man who had already decided this was happening and was simply waiting for her to agree. There was a difference. Toria had spent enough years navigating the distinction between men who offered and men who assumed to recognize it immediately. She got in anyway. The interior smelled like cedar and something colder underneath it, expensive and unplaceable. The partition between the front and back was already raised. The city moved past the tinted windows like a film she wasn't quite part of. Sang-Hoo sat beside her, not close, not performing distance either, just present in the way large, self-contained things are present, and reached into the inner pocket of his ruined jacket. He produced a tablet, set it on the console between them without a word. Toria looked at it, then at him. "Watch it," he said. She pressed play. The footage was from the ICU's internal camera system, the angle she recognized immediately as the blind spot that administration had been promising to fix for 2 budget cycles. Except it wasn't a blind spot in this footage. This footage had clearly been pulled from a secondary source, a different angle entirely, one she had never seen before and was fairly certain the hospital didn't officially possess. It showed everything. Wilmont's hand. Her hair. The sound was off, but she didn't need it. She remembered the sound internally, had been replaying it all day in the back of her skull like a frequency she couldn't tune out. She watched the nurses look away. She watched the residents' shoes become fascinating. She watched herself straighten her spine and pick up the clipboard and keep moving and felt, watching it from the outside, a grief so precise it almost had a shape. Legally, in New York State, a single piece of corroborating video evidence can be sufficient to trigger a mandatory Title VII workplace harassment investigation, something most institutions work very hard to ensure never surfaces. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "That isn't the important question." She looked at him. "What's the important question?" "What do you want to do with it?" Their hands were close on the console, not touching, but occupying the same small geography of space, her fingers near the edge of the tablet, his resting beside it. She became aware of the proximity, the way you become aware of a change in air pressure. Subtle. Physical. Impossible to unfeel once noticed. She looked back at the screen. At herself. At the moment she had spent all day pretending was smaller than it was. "I want him finished," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended and harder than she expected. Both things true at once. Sang-Hoo nodded slowly, like she had confirmed something he already knew. "Then we have the same interest." "We don't have the same anything," she said. "I don't know you. You know enough." She almost laughed. It almost came out. That's a terrifying thing to say. Most true things are. The city kept moving outside the glass. A bodega. A laundromat. 2 kids on bikes navigating the rain like it was nothing, like Brooklyn weather was just another thing you learned to move through. Toria watched them and thought about the form in her bag. The incident report she hadn't filled out. The HR director who had called her to remind her of the process, as though the process had ever protected anyone who looked like her in a building like that. She thought about 11 days of small kindnesses from a man who had no reason to offer any. She thought about a soaked shoulder and an umbrella held at the wrong angle on purpose. "What do you get out of it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain had eased into something gentler, a mist now rather than a downpour, softening the edges of the avenue into something almost beautiful. "I already got what I wanted," he said. She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her. Not with hunger, not with calculation, but with something so unguarded it sat wrong on a face built for opacity. Like a door left open in a house where every other door was locked and bolted and had been for years. She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. And knowing it was its own kind of dangerous. You didn't stumble onto this channel by accident. You were looking for something that actually moves you, and now you found it. Don't lose it. Subscribe right now, hit the notification bell, and become part of a community that lives for stories this good. Tell me in the comments, what was the moment that got you? I want to know. I'll be there waiting. There was a particular kind of silence that preceded Jeong Sang-Hoo. Not absence of sound. The ICU was never silent. Monitors and ventilators and the low constant hum of a building keeping people alive saw to that. It was more like a reorganization of sound. A subtle shift in the acoustic weight of a room that happened when he entered it, the way a forest goes quiet not because nothing is there, but because everything in it suddenly knows what is. The staff had learned it over 2 weeks. They couldn't have named it, but they felt it. Asterisk, the human brain processes social threat and physical threat in the same neural pathway, which is why the presence of a dominant individual can cause involuntary physiological responses, elevated heart rate, reduced eye contact, instinctive spatial deference. The body votes before the mind does. Asterisk. Sang-Hoo was not supposed to still be here. He was healed, cleared, released on paper. And yet here he was, occupying a chair in the third-floor family waiting area with the particular stillness of a man who had decided the rules of discharge applied to other people, reading nothing, looking at nothing, positioned with a sight line to the main corridor that was almost certainly not accidental. He saw Wilmont before Toria did. She was coming out of a patient consult, chart in hand, locks pulled back, wearing the careful neutral expression she had worn every day since the incident. The professional mask that said, "I am fine, I am competent, I am not thinking about it." He had watched her put it on every morning like protective equipment. He recognized it. He had worn versions of it for 20 years. Wilmont was waiting in the corridor. Not accidentally. He was standing in the specific way of a man who has calculated exactly how much he can do inside a professional setting and stays just inside that line, close enough to intimidate, far enough to deny. He said something low as Toria tried to pass. Sang-Hoo was on his feet before he processed the decision. He moved through the corridor unhurried, which was somehow more alarming than urgency. There was no rushing, no raised voice, nothing that the cameras could categorize as aggression. He simply materialized beside Toria with the quiet permanence of a wall appearing between her and whatever she was facing, and looked at Wilmont with an expression that contained, in concentrated form, every consequence that had not yet arrived. Wilmont went pale. Not theatrically, it was a real, involuntary draining of color, the body making an honest assessment before the ego could intervene. His mouth closed. Whatever he had been saying evaporated. His eyes moved between Sang-Hoo's face and the exit twice, quickly, the rapid calculation of a man who had spent his life being protected by institutions and had just encountered something that institutions couldn't protect him from. He left. He didn't say anything. He simply rearranged his coat, turned, and walked briskly toward the attendings' corridor without looking back. Toria watched him go. Then she turned to look at Sang-Hoo with an expression caught somewhere between gratitude and exasperation, which he was beginning to understand was her default state in relation to him. "You can't keep doing this," she said quietly. He left. "I noticed. I'm asking you." "He was in your space." He said it simply, as though this was a complete legal and moral framework requiring no further elaboration. Toria stared at him. "You're not supposed to be on this floor." I got turned around. "You have been," she stopped. Pressed her lips together. He watched her work through something internally, the visible processing of a woman who was too intelligent to pretend she didn't understand what was happening and too careful to say out loud what understanding it meant. "You have been on this floor every day this week." He said nothing. Sang-Hoo. His name in her mouth, the correct weight on the correct syllable, still did the same thing to his chest it had done on the first day. 11 days ago. 20 days ago now. "I want to make sure you're safe," he said. "I'm at work. I know where you are." That landed differently than he intended. He watched it land. Watched her expression move through several things quickly before settling on something he couldn't fully read. Not fear, not flattery, something more complicated than either. The expression of a woman standing at the edge of a decision she hasn't made yet, looking down. A nurse passed between them, oblivious, with a medication cart. The moment recalibrated. Toria looked down at her chart, then back up at him. Her voice dropped into something quieter, less clinical, less defended. "You're going to get yourself actually admitted again." "Would that be a problem?" The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. The suggestion that somewhere behind the professional mask and the careful posture and the very reasonable walls she had built, something was considering the question seriously. She walked away before it could become an answer. He watched her go and stayed exactly where he was, in the corridor that was not his floor, in the hospital he had no remaining medical reason to occupy, in the city that had given him, entirely without warning, the one thing his empire couldn't manufacture. A reason to stay somewhere. The thing about Brooklyn at 11 p.m. is that it doesn't pretend. Manhattan performs safety, the lighting, the density, the curated foot traffic of a borough that has spent decades convincing itself it's a product. Brooklyn just is, it is what it is, block by block, and Crown Heights at night is honest about its edges in a way that Toria had always respected, even as she double-locked her door and kept her keys between her fingers on the walk from the subway. She heard them before she saw them. 3 of them, positioned badly, the positioning of men who were sent rather than trained, muscle-hired for a message rather than an outcome. She recognized the distinction because she had grown up in a city that taught women to read threat the way other people read weather.
Quickly.
Accurately. Without the luxury of being wrong. The body releases norepinephrine, not adrenaline, in the first seconds of perceived threat. It sharpens vision, narrows focus, and buys the brain approximately 1.5 seconds to make a decision that could determine everything. Her 1.5 seconds told her. Wilmont's people. A warning. Maybe worse. The first one stepped into her path on the stoop. And then the night rearranged itself. Sang-Hoo came from the left, and he came without announcement, without theater, without any of the performative escalation that street violence usually builds toward. He was just suddenly inside the situation, and the first man went down with an efficiency so total it barely registered as movement, more like a change in the state of things, the man vertical and then the man not, a fact that had been quietly revised. The second came at him hard, and Sang-Hoo moved with him rather than against him, redirecting the momentum with something that looked almost gentle, almost like guidance, before it ended badly for the person being guided. The third ran. It lasted perhaps 45 seconds. He stood in the aftermath, breathing slightly harder than normal, jacket displaced, and turned to find Toria on her stoop with her keys still between her fingers, and her eyes doing the complicated thing they did when she was processing something she hadn't built a category for yet. His eyes moved over her immediately. Not her face first, but her hands, her arms, her posture, the systematic assessment of a man checking for damage before anything else. Finding none, he exhaled. Just slightly. Just enough that she caught it. You followed me home, she said. I was in the area. You live in a hotel in Dumbo. He said nothing. The silence had the quality of a man who had been caught and had decided that dignity required neither confirmation nor denial. She came down one step, then another, until she was close enough that she would have had to tilt her head up to hold his eyes, which she did, because Toria Bryant did not look away from things just because they were complicated or large or armed with a moral ambiguity she hadn't resolved yet. Are they? Alive, he said. Uncomfortable, but alive. She nodded slowly. She looked down at the 2 men on the sidewalk, conscious, groaning quietly, deeply reconsidering their evening, and back up at him. And then something happened that he wasn't prepared for. She laughed. Not loudly. It was short and involuntary, and she pressed her hand over her mouth almost immediately, but it escaped anyway, real and unguarded and exhausted. The laugh of a woman who had been terrified and is now flooded with relief and doesn't know what else to do with her body. It transformed her face completely. Made her look younger. Made her look like herself, the version underneath all the composure and the clipboard and the careful professional armor. Sang-Hoo looked at her laughing on her stoop in Crown Heights at 11 p.m. with 2 of Wilmont's men rearranged on the sidewalk and felt something move through his chest that he had genuinely never felt before. Not desire, or not only desire. Something quieter and more devastating than desire. Something that felt permanent. His smile, when it came, was soft in a way that would have alarmed every man who worked for him. Unguarded. Real. A smile that had clearly not been used enough and was slightly unsure of itself. Go inside, he said gently. She looked at him for one more moment, taking inventory, storing something, making a private decision he wasn't privy to yet. Thank you, she said, like she meant it in more directions than one. She went inside. He waited until he heard both locks turn. Then he stood on her street for a long time before he left. Every great story deserves a great audience. You've proven you're exactly that. Now make it official, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join the community that shows up for every release, every chapter, Every story that the algorithm wasn't brave enough to recommend. We found each other anyway. Subscribe, and make sure we find you next time too. She almost didn't open the door. It was past midnight when he knocked. 3 times, measured, not urgent enough to be an emergency, and too deliberate to be accidental. Toria stood on her side of it in a worn Howard University sweatshirt and bare feet, and told herself she was not going to open it. That it was insane to open it. That the metric for what constituted a reasonable decision had been quietly shifting for 3 weeks, and she needed to locate the original baseline and return to it immediately. She opened the door. He was leaning against the frame with one hand, and he was bleeding from a cut along his left cheekbone. Not badly, not dangerously, but steadily enough that a thin line of dark red had tracked down to his jaw and dried there. His jacket was gone. His shirt was dark, and his expression was the one she was learning to read, as I have calculated whether to show you this, and decided yes expression. Considered, deliberate, stripped of its usual opacity. She stepped back from the door without a word. He came in. Human skin, the body's largest organ, contains roughly 19 million cells per square inch and can begin the healing process within minutes of an injury. The hands that treat a wound carry as much weight as the medicine itself. She moved through her apartment with the muscle memory of a physician. Kit from the bathroom cabinet. Light angled from the kitchen. The practiced quiet of someone who has closed wounds at 3 a.m. more times than she could count. He sat in the chair she pointed at without argument, which she noted because he seemed like a man who argued with furniture on principle. She stood in front of him and tipped his chin up with 2 fingers to get the angle. The proximity was immediate and total. She was aware of it the way you are aware of a sound that is just below hearing, not quite processed, entirely felt. His eyes were level with her collarbone from this angle, and she could feel them without looking, steady and patient, and trained on her face with the focused attention he gave to everything, the kind of attention that made you feel simultaneously studied and safe. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. She had sewn up wounds in moving vehicles, in basement clinics, in conditions that would have made most people's hands shake. Her hands did not shake. They trembled now. Not much. A single betrayal. Once, when she pressed the antiseptic-soaked gauze to his cheekbone and felt him go very still beneath her hands, not from pain, or not only from pain. Still in the way of a man exerting significant control over his own stillness. Like the stillness was a choice he was actively making, and it was costing him something. "This is going to scar," she said quietly. "I have others." "I know." She had seen his chart. She had seen what was underneath the careful cover story of a bar fight gone wrong, had traced the map of a life written in old tissue. She hadn't asked. He hadn't explained. Some professional courtesies were really just mutual mercies. She worked in silence for a moment. The apartment was dark except for the kitchen light, which threw everything into warm gold and shadow. Outside, Brooklyn continued its late-night business. A car with too much bass, someone's argument 2 floors up, the city's constant low conversation with itself. "Why did you come here?" she asked. She meant tonight specifically, and also more broadly, and she thought he probably understood both. His eyes hadn't left her face. "I didn't want to be anywhere else." Her fingers slowed on his cheek. Just slightly. She smoothed the edge of the butterfly closure, and didn't move her hand immediately after, her fingertips resting at the border of the wound, and the unbroken skin beside it. His jaw was warm under her palm. She could feel the muscle there, the tension he was still holding, the considerable effort of a man sitting very still, and wanting to be something other than still. Sang-Hoo. His name again. She watched it do what it always did, move through him like a frequency he couldn't block. "I know," he said quietly, not answering a question she'd asked, answering one she hadn't. She stepped back, gave them both the distance. But her hand trailed from his cheek to his jaw before it left entirely, the slowest possible departure, and neither of them pretended it was clinical. She capped the antiseptic, set the kit aside, returned to the space across the room that was safer, geographically speaking, though they both understood that geography had stopped being the relevant variable some time ago. "You can stay," she said, to the middle distance. The couch is. I'll stay, he said. Not thank you, not are you sure, just, I'll stay, like it was the first easy thing either of them had been given in a very long time, and he wasn't going to complicate it. She turned off the kitchen light. In the dark, she heard him exhale, slow, complete, the breath of a man who had not fully exhaled somewhere comfortable and longer than he could remember. She understood that sound completely. She went to bed and did not sleep for a long time. He was gone when she woke up. This did not surprise her. She had half expected it. The disappearing act of a man who had allowed himself too much vulnerability the night before and needed to re-establish the geometry of control. She understood it the way she understood most things about him now, not because he explained himself, but because she had started paying the kind of attention that filled in the gaps. What she did not expect was the small black box on her kitchen counter. No note. No explanation. Just the box, positioned precisely in the center of the counter the way you position something you want to be found, next to a coffee she hadn't made that was still faintly warm. She opened it standing in her Howard sweatshirt with bare feet on cold tile. The necklace was simple, a thin chain, dark metal, not decorative in any way that announced itself. Understated to the point of invisibility. The kind of thing you could wear in an ICU without it catching on anything, without it becoming a liability. She had the thought before she'd fully formed it. Asterisk, he chose this specifically. He thought about what you do all day. Asterisk. She turned the pendant over. It was a button. Matte black, flush with the setting, easy to miss entirely if you didn't know it was there. Her physician's brain cataloged it before her emotions could interfere. Panic button. Cellular. Compact enough to be wearable without being obvious. Not a consumer product. Something custom, something that required access to resources most people didn't have and connections to infrastructure that operated outside normal channels. She stood very still with it in her palm for a long time. Asterisk personal safety devices linked to private security networks are a growing industry worth over $3 billion globally, but the ones that actually work are almost never available for purchase. They're built for specific people, by people who consider them irreplaceable. Asterisk. She thought about the form in her bag that she still hadn't filled out. She thought about HR. She thought about the 11 days of watching and the shoulder in the rain, and the 45 seconds on her stoop that ended with her laughing against her own hand in disbelief and relief, and something she was running out of names for. She put it on. She wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. She suspected he wasn't either, not fully, not yet. But she clipped the chain at the back of her neck in the bathroom mirror and looked at herself, wearing this invisible, deliberate, quietly extraordinary thing, and decided that she would figure out the meaning of it later. That some decisions were made by the body before the mind was ready to authorize them. She was late for rounds. He appeared at 6 p.m. in the hospital's ground floor atrium, which was either a coincidence or a statement, and they both knew it wasn't a coincidence. He fell into step beside her without invitation as she crossed toward the elevator bank, and for half a block of corridor neither of them spoke. The comfortable silence of two people who had moved past the phase where silence required filling. Then his eyes dropped to her collarbone, to the thin dark chain just visible above her collar. Something moved through his expression, brief, profound, the micro-adjustment of a man receiving news he had wanted badly, but hadn't let himself expect. He looked away before she could fully read it, but she had read enough. "It fits," she said. "I thought it would." She stopped at the elevator and turned to face him. He was close in the way he was always close now, inside the radius that she had stopped politely re-establishing because they both understood that establishing it required pretending something that was no longer true. "Show me how it works," she said. He reached out. His hand came to the pendant at her collarbone with a precision that was almost surgical, touching only the setting, only the device, and he explained the mechanism in a low voice, his breath against her neck, his fingers working the small components with a care that was disproportionate to the task. She was fairly certain he could have simply described it verbally. She was fairly certain he knew that too. His hands stilled when he finished, resting at the base of her throat, barely touching, not leaving. Her pulse was visible there. She knew it was visible. She knew he could feel it. "One press gets my location. he said quietly. 2 gets me. What's the difference? He looked up from the pendant to her face. The distance between them had somewhere, at some point in the last 30 seconds, become something that required a decision to maintain. His eyes moved, her mouth, back to her eyes, with the restraint of a man using every resource available to him. 1 press and I send people, he said. 2 presses and I come myself. The elevator opened behind her. Neither of them moved toward it. And, if I press it right now, she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was a skill she had spent years developing and had never been more grateful for. His thumb moved, the slowest possible movement, tracing the edge of the pendant without pressing it, a circuit of the border, learning its shape. Then I'm already here, he said. The elevator closed without them. She pressed 2 fingers to his wrist, not grabbing, just touching, just confirming something, and then she turned and took the stairs, and he stood in the atrium watching her go with the expression of a man who had just understood something about himself that was going to change everything. The hospital board convened at 9 a.m. on a Thursday in a room designed to make people feel small. Toria had been in this room before for commendations, for reviews, for the particular theater of institutional celebration that never quite included the people it was supposed to honor. She knew the table, the lighting, the careful arrangement of power that put administration at the head, and everyone else in chairs that were slightly lower than they should be. She knew how this room worked. Today she had decided it was going to work differently. She dressed with intention. Not armor exactly. She had stopped thinking about her appearance as armor, had stopped accepting the premise that she needed to prepare for combat in her own workplace. She dressed with authority, the kind that didn't ask permission from the room it entered. She arrived exactly on time. Not early, early was anxious. Not late, late was a statement she didn't need to make. Exactly on time, which was its own kind of message. In organizational psychology, this is called status signaling through temporal control. How, and when you enter a room communicates your perception of your own power before you speak a single word. Dr. Marcus Webb, chief of medicine, was already seated and already wearing his careful face, the expression of an administrator who had been briefed, who understood the severity, and who was nonetheless hoping that severity could be managed into something smaller and more institutional. Beside him, the hospital's legal counsel, 2 board members, HR. Wilmont was not present. This was, she understood, deliberate. His absence was the board's first concession, the quiet acknowledgement that the footage made his presence indefensible. She noted it the way she noted everything, precisely, without allowing the noting to show on her face. She opened her folder. What followed was not a presentation. It was a revelation, methodical, documented, and so thoroughly sourced that the legal counsel's careful neutral expression began developing cracks around the 14th minute. The footage was the foundation, but Sang-Hoo had built an entire architecture on top of it. Internal communications, a pattern of complaints from nurses that had been systematically misfiled over 4 years, 2 former residents who had suddenly become willing to provide written statements, and financial records that connected Wilmont's protected status to a donor relationship that the board was going to find extremely uncomfortable to have on paper. She hadn't asked Sang-Hoo how he got any of it. He hadn't explained. There was an understanding between them now that lived slightly outside language. She led with her truth, and he made sure her truth had everything it needed to survive the room it entered. She was the case. He was everything the case required. She was the surgeon. He was the table, the light, the instruments. The conditions for the thing to be possible at all. In the back of the room, near the door, in a chair that was slightly outside the official seating arrangement, as though he had simply placed it there, and no one had felt equipped to address this, Jeong Sang-Hoo sat with one ankle crossed over his knee and his hands folded in his lap. He had not been invited. Nobody had asked him to leave. He watched Toria work with an expression that required a specific word that didn't exist cleanly in English, something between pride and reverence and the private satisfaction of a person watching someone they believe in completely do the thing they were built to do. His jaw was relaxed. His posture was open. He looked like a man watching something that confirmed something he had always known. She reached the final section, set down the folder, looked at Webb directly. "I am not asking for an apology," she said. Her voice was level and final, the voice she used when a patient needed to hear something true that was going to be hard to receive. I am not asking for a review committee or a task force or a working group. I am asking for a termination, a formal finding, and a revision to the complaint procedure that makes it impossible for this to be misfiled again. Those are the 3 outcomes. I'll need responses to all 3 in writing by end of week. The silence in the room was the silence of people recalibrating. Webb looked at legal counsel. Legal counsel looked at the folder. The board members looked at the table with the expressions of people who had just understood that the room had changed hands at some point during the last hour and they hadn't noticed it happening. Dr. Bryant, Webb started. End of week, she said. Pleasantly. Completely. She closed the folder and stood, and in the back of the room Sang-Hoo uncrossed his ankle and rose at the same moment, not dramatically, not drawing attention, simply rising because she was done and therefore he was done. And the synchronization of it was so natural, so unrehearsed, that 2 board members noticed it and said nothing because there was genuinely nothing institutional to say about a man standing up when a woman finishes speaking. She walked to the door. He held it. In the corridor, out of sight of the boardroom's glass panels, she exhaled, long, complete, the exhale of a woman setting down something very heavy she had been carrying for a long time. He said nothing. He simply walked beside her down the corridor, their arms close, their steps matching, and she felt from him what she had felt from the beginning. That particular, specific, unprecedented warmth of being stood beside rather than stood in front of, protected without being diminished, accompanied without being managed. End of week, he said quietly, with something in his voice that was not quite a smile and entirely was. End of week, she confirmed. They walked toward the elevator together and this time, when it opened, they both got in. Here's what I know about you. You didn't skip. You stayed for every word. You felt the fountain scene. You felt the lobby. You felt that tension land like a stone in still water. People like you are exactly who this channel exists for. Subscribe right now, the bell, the whole thing, and tell me in the comments, what do you think that midnight phone call means? I have a theory. Let's talk. The police came on a Tuesday, which felt right somehow. Nothing catastrophic ever happens on a Friday. The universe has enough narrative sense to save its reckonings for the middle of the week, when there's nowhere to hide in the days that follow. Toria was in the middle of a consult on the 4th floor when her pager went off. Not her medical pager, the secondary one she had started carrying since the board meeting, the one connected to a number with no name attached that sent exactly 2 kinds of messages. Heads up and now. This one said now. She handed her chart to the resident without explanation and took the stairs. The lobby of Brooklyn Central had transformed into something between a crime scene and a press event. 2 NYPD detectives in plain clothes. 1 ADA she recognized from a malpractice case 2 years prior. 3 uniforms positioned at the main entrance with the particular stillness of people who have been told to be visible. And at the center of it, Dr. Randy Wilmont, still in his white coat, still wearing the institutional armor of a man who had spent decades believing the coat made him untouchable, being informed in measured legal language that it did not. In the United States, Title VII workplace violations compounded with criminal assault charges carry a mandatory review by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, a federal body so backlogged it processes over 67,000 charges annually, which is precisely why most victims never see resolution. Unless someone builds the case so airtight that backlog becomes irrelevant. Sang-Hoo had built it airtight. Wilmont saw her first. She watched his face move through denial, calculation, and something approaching genuine fear in the space of 3 seconds, the rapid internal collapse of a man whose entire self-concept had just been structurally compromised. His mouth opened. She held his gaze and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction, which surprised her. She had expected satisfaction. What she felt instead was quieter and more complete, the specific peace of a closed wound. Not pleasure at the closing, just the absence of the damage that had been there before. She had been braced for him to say something, to perform one final piece of dominance for the lobby audience. Instead, he simply looked at her, really looked, possibly for the first time, and looked away. The ADA said something to the detective. The detective touched Wilmont's elbow. The white coat moved toward the exit. Toria became aware of Sang-Hoo beside her without hearing him arrive, which she had stopped being startled by and started accepting as one of his fixed properties, like weather or gravity. He was simply there, at her left shoulder, close enough that the sleeve of his jacket brushed her arm. He reached up and brushed a stray lock from her face. Not quickly, not discreetly, slowly, deliberately. With the unhurried confidence of a man making a public statement he had decided to make clearly, his fingers moving the hair from her temple to behind her ear with a tenderness so unself-conscious that two nurses at the reception desk stopped their conversation entirely and a passing orderly walked into a cart. In the lobby of Brooklyn Central, in front of the detectives and the ADA and the staff and the patients in waiting room chairs, Jeong Sang-Hoo touched Toria Bryant's face like she was something he had decided to stop hiding. She went very still. Then she turned to look at him and found him watching Wilmont's exit with a calm expression of a man who had just finished a very long project and was satisfied with the result. He felt her looking, turned to meet her eyes. "It's done," he said. She held his gaze and felt the lobby recede, the noise, the people, the fluorescent hum of a building that had been the entire world of her crisis for weeks shrinking down to the small, precise geography between her eyes and his. "Not quite," she said. His brow moved. A question. She looked at him, at the cheekbone she had closed 11 days ago, still faintly marked, at the shoulder that had taken Brooklyn rain so she didn't have to, at the hands that had built something careful and total out of her truth and handed it back to her as power, and she made the decision that her body had been making for weeks while her mind wrote objections in the margins. "We need to talk," she said. "Not here." Something in his face opened. Just slightly. Just enough. "I know somewhere," he said. She looked at the lobby, at the place that had asked her to file a form, at the fluorescent lights and the institutional walls, and the 4 years of her career inside this building that had given her everything and protected her from nothing. She unclipped her ID badge from her coat, looked at it once, set it at the reception desk with a deliberateness that several people witnessed and nobody misunderstood. "Let's go," she said. The car was different this time. Not the black sedan of Atlantic Avenue and careful distance. This was an SUV, blacked out, with luggage in the back that she definitely had not packed, and yet somehow contained exactly the things she would have packed if she had been given the time and the warning and the presence of mind. Which she had not been given because her presence of mind had been occupied with Wilmont and board meetings and the quiet seismic activity of falling for someone she had absolutely no framework for. She looked at the bag in the back and looked at him. "You had someone go to my apartment. You have a spare key under the Monstera pot," he said, without a trace of apology. "It's a bad hiding spot. It's a great hiding spot. 3 of my men found it independently before I told them to stop looking." She stared at him. He kept his eyes on the road with the expression of a man who had made a series of decisions and was at peace with all of them. South Korea issues more patents per capita than any other country on Earth, a nation that rebuilt itself from near-total devastation in 1953 into a global technology and cultural powerhouse in under 70 years. Seoul is its crown, a city of 10 million that operates like it has something to prove and the infrastructure to prove it. Asterisk. "We're going to Seoul," she said. Not a question. Processing it out loud, which she had found was sometimes the only way. "Yes. You have a situation there. A business situation." He glanced at her sideways. "That's one word for it. Sang-Hoo. The name, the weight, the frequency." She watched it move through him. Wilmont's brother. The one with the Brooklyn operation. He's not going to let this sit. "No," he agreed. "He's not. So we're leaving. We're relocating strategically." That is the same thing. It's a different thing with better architecture. She turned in her seat to face him fully, and he drove with the calm of a man who had already run every version of this conversation and was prepared for all of them. Outside, Brooklyn scrolled past, the bodegas, the brownstones, the particular grammar of streets she had learned over 10 years of building a life here, block by block, patient by patient, quiet act of survival by quiet act of survival. She felt something about leaving it. Not grief exactly, More like the sensation of a chapter ending. Not tragically, not incompletely, but genuinely ending. The last page turned, the weight of it real, and the rightness of it equally real. "Tell me about Seoul," she said. Something happened in his face that she was becoming fluent in, the involuntary softening that preceded every moment he allowed himself to be known. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man choosing where to begin. "Loud," he said. "Efficient. The hospitals are extraordinary. You would have opinions about them immediately and be running something within a year." He paused. "There's a neighborhood called Itaewon. It doesn't ask you to be anything other than what you are. You'd like it." "You've thought about this," she said, softly. "I've thought about it since day 4. The honesty of it sat between them, large and unhurried. He had been thinking about a life with her since day 4 of 11 days in a Brooklyn ICU with a cover story about a bar fight. She absorbed this the way she absorbed most things from him. Not with surprise, because she had passed surprise some time ago, but with the particular gravity of something that was true and large and was going to require her full attention. "I haven't said yes," she said. "No," he agreed. "I haven't said no either." "No," he agreed, and the corner of his mouth moved. She faced forward. The highway opened up ahead of them, the city thinning into the organized approach to JFK, the skyline behind them in the side mirror doing what skylines do when you're leaving, assembling itself into something more beautiful than it ever looked from inside it, as though places only become fully visible in departure. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number, Brooklyn area code, a message of 3 words that landed in her chest like cold water. He knows already. She showed Sang-Hoo the screen, without speaking. His jaw set, not the impulsive lock of the ICU, not the reactive tightening of a man surprised. The deliberate setting of a man who had anticipated this variable and was now moving it from the projected column to the confirmed column. "Wilmont's brother," she said. "Yes." "How far behind is he?" Sang-Hoo checked his mirror. Then his phone, one glance, returned his eyes to the road. 30 minutes. Maybe less. The airport signs appeared overhead. Terminal 4. Departures. "You said Seoul," she said. Her voice was steady. Her heart was doing something urgent and entirely alive inside her chest. "Tell me there's a plan after we land." "There are 4 plans," he said, ranked by outcome. "Tell me the best one." He pulled into departures and stopped the car and turned to look at her fully. This woman who had treated him like a person in a city that had mostly treated him like a weapon, who had closed his wounds and opened doors and stood in a boardroom and delivered truth like a verdict, who was sitting in his car outside JFK with someone dangerous 30 minutes behind them and her medical ID on a reception desk and everything uncertain and forward-facing and alive. He looked at her like she was the plan, like she had always been the plan. "The best one requires you to trust me," he said. Behind them, somewhere in the Brooklyn night, headlights were moving in their direction with purpose. She picked up her bag from the back seat, opened her door, looked at him over her shoulder with the expression of a woman who had made her decision somewhere around day 4 also, and had simply been waiting for the moment to say it out loud. "I put on the necklace, didn't I?" she said. He was out of the car before she finished the sentence. They ran toward the terminal together. Not from fear, or not only from fear, but with the specific forward momentum of 2 people who have stopped running from things and started running toward them, toward the gate and the flight and the city waiting on the other side of 12 hours of sky, toward 4 plans ranked by outcome and a neighborhood that didn't ask you to be anything other than what you were. And somewhere behind them, tires screamed against the departure lane asphalt, headlights swinging wide, the chaos that had been 30 minutes away arriving, as chaos always does, ahead of schedule. Sang-Hoo grabbed her hand. She held on. "Don't let the algorithm decide whether you come back. You do that. Right now. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and take control of your own story diet. No more missing releases. No more finding out 3 days late that a new video dropped. You're part of this now. Act like it. And while you're down there in the comments, tell me your favorite line from this entire story. Mine might surprise you.